All Creatures Great and Small, Chapter 23. Milk fever is one of the straightforward conditions, but looking down into the beck in the dreary dawn light, I realized that this was one of its more bizarre manifestations. The illness had struck immediately after calving, and the cow had slithered down the muddy bank into the water. She was unconscious when I arrived, her hindquarters completely submerged, the head resting on a shelf of rock. Her calf, sodden and pathetic in the driving rain, trembled by her side. Dan Cooper's eyes were anxious as we made our way down. I doubt we're too late. She's dead, isn't she? I can't see her breathing. Pretty far gone, I'm afraid, I replied, but I think there's still life there. If I can get some calcium into her veins, she might still come round. Damn, I hope so, Dan grunted. She's one of my best milkers. It always happens to the good uns. It does with milk fever anyway. Here, hold these bottles for me. I pulled out the syringe and selected a wide-bored needle. My fingers, numb with the special kind of cold you felt in the early morning, with your circulation sluggish and your stomach empty, could hardly hold it. The water was deeper than I thought, and it was over my Wellington tops at the first stride. Gasping, I bent down and dug my thumb into the jugular furrow at the base of the neck. The vein came up, and as I pushed the needle in, the blood ran warm and dark over my hand. I fumbled the flutter valve from my pocket, pushed a bottle into the cup end, and inserted the other end into the needle. The calcium began to flow into the vein. Standing there in the icy beck, holding the bottle aloft with bloody fingers and feeling the rain working its way inside my collar, I tried to keep out the black thoughts about all those people I knew who were still in bed and would only leave it when their alarm clocks rang. And they would read their papers over breakfast and drive out to their cozy banks or insurance offices. Maybe I should have been a doctor. They treated their patients in nice, warm bedrooms. I pulled the needle from the vein and threw the empty bottle onto the bank. There was no response to the injection. I took the other bottle and began to run more calcium under the skin. Might as well go through the motions, futile though it seemed now. It was when I was rubbing away the subcutaneous injection that I noticed the eyelids quiver. A quick ripple of relief and excitement went through me. I looked up at the farmer and laughed. She's still with us, Dan. I flicked her ear and her eyes opened wide. We'll wait a few minutes and then try to roll her onto her chest. Within a quarter of an hour, she was beginning to toss her head about, and I knew it was time. I caught hold of her horns and pulled while Dan and his tall son pushed at her shoulder. We made slow progress, but after several concerted heaves, the cow took over herself and settled on her chest. Immediately, everything looked rosier. When a cow is lying on her side, she always has the look of death on her. I was pretty sure then that she would recover, but I couldn't go away and leave her lying in the beck. Milk fever cows can stay down for days on end, but I had the feeling this one would be up soon. I decided to stick it out a bit longer. She didn't seem to relish her situation in the peaty water and began to make determined efforts to rise, but it was another half hour and my teeth were chattering uncontrollably before she finally staggered to her feet. Well, that's a liquor, Dan said. I never thought she'd stand again. Must be good stuff you gave her. It's a bit quicker than the old bicycle pump, I laughed. The spectacular effects of intravenous calcium were still enough of a novelty to intrigue me. For generations, cows with milk fever had just died. Then inflation of the udder had saved many. But the calcium was the thing. When they got up within an hour like this one, I always felt like a successful conjurer. We guided the cow up the bank, and at the top, the full force of the wind and rain struck us. The house was only 100 yards away, and we battled towards it, Dan and his son leading, holding the calf in a sack slung between them. The tiny animal swung to and fro, screwing up its eyes against the hard world it had entered. Close behind followed the anxious mother, still rocky on her legs, but doing her best to poke her muscle into the sack. I squelched along in the rear. We left the cow knee-deep in straw in a warm shed, licking her calf vigorously. In the porch of the house, the others dutifully pulled off their Wellingtons. I did the same, pouring about a pint of Beck water from each boot. Mrs. Cooper had the reputation of being a firebrand who exercised an iron rule over Dan and her family. But from my previous contacts with her, I had the feeling that Dan didn't do so badly. I thought so again as I saw her, square built but comely, plaiting a little girl's pigtails in readiness for school. A crackling fire was mirrored in the gleaming brass of the hearth, and above the clean farmhouse smell there was a hint of home-cured bacon just beginning to fry. Mrs. Cooper sent Dan and the boys scurrying upstairs to change their socks. Then she turned a calm gaze on me as I dripped on her linoleum. She shook her head as though I were a naughty child. "All right, off with the socks," she rapped out, "and your coat, and roll up your trousers, and sit down here and dry your hair with this." A clean towel landed on my lap, and Mrs. Cooper bent over me. "Don't you ever think of wearing a hat?" "Not keen on them, I'm afraid," I mumbled, and she shook her head again. She poured hot water from a kettle into a large bowl and added mustard from a pound tin. "Here, stick your feet in this." I'd obeyed all her commands with alacrity, and I gave an involuntary yelp as I made contact with the bubbling mixture. At this, she shot a fierce glance at me, and I took care to keep my feet in the bowl. I was sitting, teeth clenched, enveloped in steam, when she pushed a pint pot of tea into my hand. It was old-fashioned treatment, but effective. By the time I was halfway down the pint pot, I felt as though I was being consumed by fire. The riverbed chill was a dream which vanished completely as Mrs. Cooper topped up my bowl with another scalding quart from the kettle. Next, she grabbed chair and bowl and swiveled me round till I was sitting at the table, still with my feet in the water. Dan and the children were already at their breakfast, and in front of me was a plate with 2 eggs, a rough-cut piece of bacon, and several sausages. I had learned enough of Dale's ways to keep quiet at meals. When I first came to the district, I had thought it incumbent on me to provide light conversation in return for their hospitality. But the questioning glances they exchanged with each other silenced me effectively. So, this morning, I attacked the food without preamble. But the first mouthful almost made me break my newfound rule. It was the first time I had tasted a homemade Yorkshire sausage, and it was an effort to restrain the cries of congratulation which would have been natural in other circles. But Mrs. Cooper had been watching me out of the corner of her eye, and she must have noticed my rapt expression. Casually she rose, brought over the frying pan, and rolled a few more links onto my plate. "Killed a pig last week," she said, pulling open the pantry door. I could see the dishes heaped with chopped meat, spare rib, liver, the rows of pies with the jelly gleaming on their pale gold crusts. I finished my meal, pulled on a thick pair of socks borrowed from Dan, and my dry shoes. I was about to leave when Mrs. Cooper tucked a parcel under my arm. I knew it contained further samples from the pantry, but her eyes dared me to say much about it. I muttered a few words of thanks and went out to the car. The church clock was chiming 9:15 when I pulled up outside Skeldale House. I felt good, warm, full of superb food, and with the satisfying memory of the cow's quick recovery. And there was my parcel on the back seat. It was always a stroke of luck to land on a farm after a pig killing, and there was usually a gift from the hospitable farmers. But these sausages were something I would never forget. I took the surgery steps at a jump and trotted along the passage, but as I rounded the corner, my progress was halted. Siegfried was standing there, rigid, his back pressed against the wall. Over his shoulder dangled a long, flexible leather probang. Between us was the half-open door of the office, with Miss Harbottle clearly visible at her desk. I waved cheerfully. Hello, hello. Off to a choke? Siegfried's face twisted in anguish, and he held up a warning hand. Then he began to peep past the door, balancing on the balls of his feet like a tightrope walker. He was beyond the door, and the tense lines of his body had begun to relax, when the brass end of the swinging probang clattered against the wall, and as if in reply came the familiar rumble from Miss Harbottle's corner. Siegfried gave me a single despairing glance. Then, shoulders drooping, he went slowly into the room. Watching him go, I thought wonderingly of how things had built up since the secretary's arrival. It was naked war now, and it gave life an added interest to observe the tactics of the two sides. At the beginning, it seemed that Siegfried must run out an easy winner. He was the employer. He held the reins, and it appeared that Miss Harbottle would be helpless in the face of his obstructive strategy. But Miss Harbottle was a fighter, and a resourceful one, and it was impossible not to admire the way she made use of the weapons at her command. In fact, over the past week, the tide had been running in her favor. She'd been playing Siegfried like an expert fisherman with a salmon, bringing him repeatedly back to her desk to answer footling questions. Her throat clearing had developed into an angry bark, which could penetrate the full extent of the house. And she had a new weapon. She had taken to writing Siegfried's clerical idiocies on slips of papers, misspellings, errors in addition, wrong entries. They were all faithfully copied down. Miss Harbottle used these slips as ammunition. She never brought one out when things were slack and her employer was hanging about the surgery. She saved them until he was under pressure. Then she would push a slip under his nose and say, "How about this?" She always kept an expressionless face at these times, and it was impossible to say how much pleasure it gave her to see him cower back like a whipped animal. But the end was unvarying. Mumbled explanations and apologies from Siegfried and Miss Harbottle, radiating self-righteousness, correcting the entry. As Siegfried went into the room, I watched through the partly open door. I knew my morning round was waiting, but I was impelled by morbid curiosity. Miss Harbottle, looking brisk and businesslike, was tapping an entry in the book with her pen, while Siegfried shuffled his feet and muttered replies. He made several vain attempts to escape, and as the time passed, I could see he was nearing breaking point. His teeth were clenched, and his eyes had started to bulge. The phone rang, and the secretary answered it. Her employer was making again for the door when she called happily, "Colonel Brent for you." Like a man in a dream, he turned back. The colonel, a racehorse owner, had been a thorn in our flesh for a long time, with his complaints and his continual questioning and probing. A call from him was always liable to send up the blood pressure. I could see it was that way this morning. The minutes ticked away, and Siegfried's face got redder. He made his replies in a choked voice, which finally rose almost to a shout. At the end, he crashed the receiver down and leaned on the desk, breathing heavily. Then, as I watched unbelievingly, Miss Harbottle began to open the drawer where she kept her slips. She fished one out, coughed, and held it in Siegfried's face. How about this? She asked. I resisted the impulse to close my eyes and stared in horror. For a few seconds, nothing happened, and there was a tense interval while Siegfried stood quite motionless. Then his face seemed to break up, and with a scything sweep of his arm, he snatched the slip from the secretary's hand and began to tear at it with fierce intensity. He didn't say a word, but as he tore, he leaned forward over the desk, and his glaring eyes approached ever nearer to Miss Harbottle, who slowly edged her chair back till it was jammed against the wall. It was a weird picture. Miss Harbottle straining back, her mouth slightly open, her tinted curls bobbing in alarm, and Siegfried, his ravaged features close to hers, still tearing with insane vigor at the piece of paper. The scene ended when Siegfried, putting every ounce of his strength into action like a javelin thrower, hurled the torn up slip at the wastepaper basket. It fell in a gentle shower, like confetti, in and around the basket, and Siegfried, still without speaking, wrapped his probang around him and strode from the room. In the kitchen, Mrs. Hall opened the parcel and extracted a pie, a chunk of liver, and a cluster of the exquisite sausages. She turned a quizzical eye on me. You look kind of pleased with yourself this morning, Mr. Harriet. I leaned back against the oak dresser. Yes, Mrs. Hall. I've just been thinking it must be very nice to be the principal of a practice, but it's not such a bad life being an assistant.